All right, so I'm going to talk about bringing one of the critical security features of Wormhole to EigenLayer. And this is kind of a proof of concept that we came up with a few weeks ago, but just something, or case study, or an idea that, something that's pretty critical to the Wormhole ecosystem and to the technology itself, in trying to bring something like that to EigenLayer. So let's go over Wormhole basics for a second. So this is just a flow diagram of how a transaction might get authenticated in the Wormhole protocol. So on the right-hand side, we have the user who submits a transaction, and that might go through some application-specific layer, but then under the hood, under the Wormhole messaging abstraction, all of this is sort of handled. We have the attestation layer in the middle, which is the Guardian network, which essentially validates messages that go through the Wormhole protocol. And then on the other side, those signatures are verified, and you get a message on your destination chain. And so most of it's handled under the hood. All right. So I would argue that security is the critical feature for bridges or for cross-chain messaging. It is the single most important thing, I think, as all of you might realize. Over the past few years or past few months, there's been a bridge hack almost every month or every few weeks. And we really think there's sort of like two important aspects to this. One is really the verification model, which is the sort of mechanism by which you're able to authenticate messages that go from one source chain to a destination chain. And right now, there's the Guardian network is sort of that verification mechanism. There's 19 Guardians who participate in this ecosystem. You need a 2/3 quorum to actually validate a message. And then there's all sorts of other things that we might talk about in the context of security. There's the governor, which is a security feature that I won't talk about necessarily right now, but there's the global accountant, which is the focus of this presentation, and then there's all sorts of other things like contract audits that we might include in security. But you might say, okay, what if I swap out the verification mechanism to something like ZK? Does this change the security landscape at all? And I would argue, yes, it does, but it only changes the verification model. Because really, defense in depth security is orthogonal to your verification model. A lot of people, I think, like to talk about security in the context of which verification model you're using, but even if you swap out the verification model, you still need defense in depth measures like the governor, like the accountant, and like contract audits and all sorts of other security features that are kind of important in this context. So we're going to focus on the global accountant today, but let's see. Let's go back to kind of the Wormhole diagram, right? You might have noticed there was nothing about security in this diagram that I referenced. So now I'm going to talk about how we put this sort of like security stuff in this framework. So what is the global accountant? There's really two main things that the global accountant does. One, it logs token balances across all the Wormhole connected chains. So at this point, it's 22 different connected chains in many different runtimes that it's logging token balances for. And then it rejects those messages that attempt to transfer more than the available balance on that source chain. So it's a very simple measure, but it makes sure that there's sort of reconciliation across these many different chains for token transfers. And there's a very simple invariant here. I just sort of encoded that number 2 basically in mathematical form, but it basically just says that guardians don't accept messages if the payload size is basically larger than the value that's locked in the source chain. So what does the global accountant architecturally look like today? So a user will submit a transaction, either through some application-specific logic or either through the Wormhole core contract, and the guardians will pick up that message and attempt to validate that message. They'll sign it. There'll be 13 different SecP signatures on it if it's a valid message, and then it'll be relayed to the destination chain. Right? But in this model, it actually goes through the global accountant first. So it routes those messages through the global accountant. The global accountant says, hey, I think this doesn't violate the condition that we just talked about. And the guardians will then sign the message so that it's then sent to the destination chain. And right now, the global accountant sits as a Cosmos contract on a chain called Gateway, a Cosmos chain called Gateway. There's two main sort of functions that this chain does right now. It hosts the Cosmos contract or module for the global accountant, and it also supports a bunch of other features, including ways to actually move messages from other chains to the Cosmos ecosystem. So essentially functions as a router to the Cosmos ecosystem. And we're going to talk about why that might be problematic in this presentation. Okay, so what does the global accountant look like on EigenLayer now? So this is sort of a very simplified diagram of what it might look like, but the blue sort of denotes the Wormhole-specific components, and the green denotes the EigenLayer components. And this is a very simple sort of AVS model, right? Where you have the user submitting a transaction, it goes through some application-specific logic, it'll still go through the core contracts. But now, instead of routing it through this Cosmos module, which is on this chain called Gateway, which is also run by the guardians, or the authenticators in this case, we actually have ETH restakers, or I'll also talk about native restakers participating in actually authenticating or validating these messages in the context of the account. And so this is very simple. This is you have these node operators that are then sending these things to the aggregators, and then the eigenlayer contracts actually determining which operators can actually participate in this AVS. And so there's sort of two main advantages that I wanted to highlight here. One is really independent validation. So now we have an independent set of parties that are actually responsible for maintaining the integrity of the token bridge in this case, right? So you don't have the Guardian network, which is operating the security feature, being the sort of source of trust that's watching the Guardian network, right? And so we don't want to have this like circular dependency in a critical security feature. And so I would argue that this potentially offers another way for participants who are not necessarily authenticating messages in the Wormhole framework, but also participating in something that's critical to the ecosystem. And then it also removes the dependency really on Gateway, right? And it sort of ensures a separation concerns between something that's really meant for moving messages into the Cosmos ecosystem and out, and a critical security feature that's meant to kind of protect the integrity of these high value payloads or messages. And so we can actually move those modules and separate them out quite easily without having to spin up a different Cosmos chain or having to do things that are a bit more complicated from an engineering standpoint. Okay, so I would argue, I think, dual quorum is actually the best way to achieve this. And what I mean by this is that we have both ETH restakers and native token, or restakers of the native token, participate in actually authenticating or validating messages that go through the global accountant. And there's sort of like three main advantages that I want to point out. One really is that it leverages the economic security of two different tokens, right? You have on one hand the economic security of ETH participating and securing this feature, and at the same time you have the native token participating, or stakers of the native token participating in this. And the real advantage of this is that you have these native stakers that are also participating, and this is the token by which, and the asset by which people in that specific ecosystem are getting incentivized to actually provide resources and to do work for this ecosystem. And so why wouldn't you want them to sort of participate in this? It's very natural for them to be there. But at the same time, it's very easy to sort of bootstrap an ETH validator set out of this because you have access to restaked ETH. And that's really the advantage of this. And so we have sort of on both sides, we have the ETH restakers and then the native restakers, and then sort of this quorum logic piece that I'll talk about where you can sort of combine the restakers in custom ways to kind of make a system that's a bit more robust than just having ETH restakers. So the first one I'll talk about is kind of what I call like equal dual quorum. And this is a very simple system, right? So it sort of just says, 2/3 of the total stake weight of the ETH restakers must sort of sign off on this message for it to be deemed valid. And then the native restakers, 2/3 of the native stake weight also has to kind of provide economic security for this global accountant feature. And this is an and condition. So both of them have to be met for this to be deemed a valid transfer. And now this is a bit more complicated, but this is something I call like preferred dual quorum, which is basically assigning precedence or hierarchy to each subset of the restakers. And so you can extend this idea a little bit further, but I'll just walk through kind of a basic approach to this, which basically says if I have ETH restakers and then I have native restakers, I'll assign a higher precedence to the ETH restakers because for some reason I believe that they are more equipped to actually deal with this problem. And so 2/3 of the stake weight of the ETH restakers first try to validate whether or not this transfer is valid. If they say no, then it'll go to the native stakers. And if they say no, then it's not valid, right? But if the native restakers say yes, then it is deemed to be valid. And so what you're doing is basically having these, assigning like trigger conditions or precedents to these various subsets. And you can actually combine these in very interesting ways as well. You can have, in a multi-quorum model, have different subsets participate as, in an equal dual quorum that might get put into a larger, preferred dual quorum system, right? And you can kind of imagine if you had n number of these, like how you might want to chain them together to kind of create a custom restaking model for your system. And just for completeness, I'll list the safety and liveness conditions here. But the idea here is that when you move from an equal dual quorum system to a preferred dual quorum system, what you're doing is, you might be sacrificing safety, but you're gaining in liveness. And so the idea is like, if I can kind of construct a multi-quorum system where I have in a sort of custom way, then I can sort of tune these parameters to the way in which I want for my system. Okay, so in the case of Wormhole and the global accountant, what are the invariants or what are the slashing conditions? What is the invariant that has to hold in the system? And it's very simple. The restaked ETH plus the restaked native token, whatever that notional value is, has to be greater than the current amount of notional value of tokens that are being transferred in the protocol at the moment. So if there's $10 million worth of tokens being moved, across the ecosystem, across the Wormhole or across Wormhole's connected chains, there has to be that much economic security at that given period. And I won't define what that period specifically is at the time because it's a bit more complicated to do across kind of synchronized time across multiple blockchains. But that's sort of the idea or invariant that has to hold. And I'll just note here as well that in this dual quorum model, we need to make sure that for restakers to actually participate, we need to offer them some sort of incentive to come and actually participate in that ecosystem. So it's either through ETH or the native token. All right, so I would argue that securing ETH transfers is probably the easiest way to kind of bootstrap this type of network right now. So for a node to actually participate as someone who's actually participating in the global accountant, you actually need to run a full node for that chain. And so, eigenlayer restakers or operators are already running full nodes for Ethereum, and so it's quite natural for them to actually participate in the global accountant because the only marginal cost for them of security to secure this global accountant is to basically watch for Wormhole events, and that's actually quite trivial. And so, after this, we can probably you can move to other chains, run full nodes for other chains, but this is a kind of model, or at least proof of concept that I wanted to kind of demonstrate here. All right, that's it.